Having visualized a few instances of how initially separate ethnos had begun to fuse into cohesive culture-driven population clusters as a generative process, we can now explore the societal roots of this phenomenon and shared criteria. The formative period of the archaic era witnessed the gradual crystallization of distinct civic identities among the emerging Greek city-states. It is during this epoch that the nascent foundations of what would later be recognized as Hellenic identity began to take shape. Initially autonomous in character, these city-states progressively engaged in intercommunal interaction, fostering socio-cultural affinities that laid the groundwork for an eventual collective ethnos. The fabrication of mythical genealogies during this period served dual functions. On one hand, they legitimized territorial claims by invoking descent from heroic ancestors. On the other, they manufactured a shared lineage that later generations of Greeks would retroactively embrace as evidence of ethnic cohesion. This process of identity construction was underpinned by common linguistic usage and the shared observance of religious practices, both of which played integral roles in daily life. These elements, language, cult, and lineage, came to serve as the primary indicia of Hellenic ethnicity. The ancient historian Herodotus, writing in the classical period, systematizes these markers in his narrative of the Persian Wars, presenting a retrospective and idealized notion of the Hellene that had not yet fully materialized in the archaic consciousness. In his histories, Herodotus codifies a form of self-recognition among Greeks, framed primarily through their opposition to the culturally and politically distinct Persians. His portrayal is thus both descriptive and prescriptive. It articulates a self-image while also promoting it. Herodotus' conception of Hellenism is deeply shared by the Athenian intellectual milieu in which he was situated. He elevated notions such as liberty and self-governance, values associated with democratic Athens, as quintessentially Hellenic, implicitly contrasting them with the perceived despotism of the Persian regime. Through a narrative technique that defies the Greek by what he is not, Herodotus constructs an identity matrix rooted in contrast and cultural perceived superiority. In a notable episode from Book 8, Herodotus synthesizes elements of kinship, shared religious observance, and linguistic commonality with shared societal customs. This can be a form to articulate the early template for Greek ethnicity. While it would be anachronistic to claim the existence of a formal pan-Hellenic identity during the archaic period, since extant documentary evidence does not attest such self-conception at the time, the elements that later coalesced into a coherent ethnic identity are already fully perceptible. If you're enjoying this video so far, please take a moment to check out my Patreon page. With as little as a $5 support, you can help us ensure that we can continue to produce high quality and high researched content. And at the same time, you get access to polls, extra videos, unlisted streams, and much more. Thank you so much. The emergence of a unified Hellenic identity was not a sudden occurrence, but rather the result of a millennium-long evolution, culminating in a construct that bears little resemblance to the fragmented realities of early Greek societies. The term ancient Greek itself is frequently misapplied, suggesting a degree of unity among the diverse communities scattered across the Aegean that did not, in fact, exist in any fixed or absolute form. The various ethni developed along divergent cultural and political lines, coming together only sporadically and often under exceptional circumstances, are the truer image. Despite the apparent stasis of the preceding centuries, the socio-political landscape of early Iron Age Greece underwent a rapid transformation with the advent of the poleis. The establishment of autonomous city-states afforded communities the space to cultivate unique identities. In time, these discrete developments would give rise to mutual recognition, a realization of shared trajectories that seeded the growth of a broader Hellenic image. By the dawn of the 8th century BC, Greece was emerging from a prolonged period of demographic and cultural regression. The term Hellas, denoting both the geographical expanse and the cultural shape encompassing the southern Balkan Peninsula and adjacent Aegean coastline, housed numerous groups whose internal perceptions mirrored the region's fragmented terrain. Rugged mountains, isolated populations, and coastal dispersion fostered maritime dependency. These conditions encouraged a maritime orientation, making seafaring and access to trade routes key determinants of regional power and prestige. Over time, this gave rise to maritime civilizations that came to include the many Aegean islands within the expanding orbit of Hellenic culture and influence. Preceding the Archaic period, however, much of this same geographic area had been dominated by the Mycenaean civilization, an expansive and sophisticated society that experienced an abrupt population collapse. This decline precipitated the onset of the so-called Dark Age, from which Greece would only emerge in the 8th century. Archaeological evidence, particularly funerary remains, reflect this dramatic demographic shift. Anthony Snodgrass, through grave analysis, identified a substantial increase in burials between 950 and 700 BC, suggesting a population explosion that played a catalytic role in societal regeneration. This demographic rebound did not in isolation inaugurate the Archaic Age, but it fostered environmental and societal conditions conducive to its emergence. The absence of contemporary literary sources aside from epic traditions attributed to Homer and Hesiod renders this period opaque. Nevertheless, material remains such as burial feasts and botanical analyses, such as pollen counts, provide precious insight into subsistent patterns. Evidence suggests a decline in arable agriculture across the 11th to the 9th century BC, consistent with a pastoral economy. By contrast, the early Archaic period sees the reintroduction of crop cultivation, indicating increasing sedentism and the re-establishment of permanent settlements. These agrarian communities gradually developed interconnectivity, facilitating the circulation of practices and ideas. The recovery of arable farming and the ensuing settlement continuity created the preconditions for cultural exchange and eventually the rise of city-state-based civilization. The city-state became the dominant organization unit of ancient Hellas, a political, economic, and religious nucleus surrounded by territory subject to its authority. Civic loyalty and identification with one's polis became central to individual identity and precursor to the collective one. Paradoxically, while the polis reinforced localism, it also provided a framework through which pan-Hellenic consciousness could emerge. As cities matured in relative isolation, they began to recognize resonant values and practices in neighboring communities, generating a sense of shared heritage. This in turn led to an increasing preoccupation with questions of ethnicity and collective belonging. In a sense, ethnic identity may be seen as one modality within a broader matrix of common identity, denoting perceived bonds of connection and mutual recognition, shared territory, tradition, language, descent, but above all, a sense of peoplehood. Jeremy McInerney argues a sense of ethnicity is meaningless without processes of inclusion and exclusion. Yet, long before Hellenes faced a major foreign other, ethnic consciousness developed primarily through what Jonathan M. Hall describes as the aggregative mode, the core of the thesis lying within the concept of mythopoetic tradition. This ancestral genealogy will be the basis of how the word Hellene will be interwoven, first ground up and solidified through Book 8 of Herodotus' history. To conclude our discussion, a comprehensive assessment of Herodotus' historiographical legacy in antiquity can be elevated through Plutarch's critical reception of his works. A distinguished philosopher, historian, and moralist of the early imperial period, in his polemical treatise De Herodoti Malignitate, on the malice of Herodotus, Plutarch offers a scathing indictment of what he perceives as Herodotus' tenditious narrative strategies and ideological partiality. Central to Plutarch's objection is the claim that Herodotus exhibits a discernible pro-Athenian bias, one which manifests in the unjust vilification of other Greek poleis, most notably Thebes and Corinth. In Plutarch's view, Herodotus' historiographical lens privileges the Athenian polis at the expense of a more equitable portrayal of the broader Hellenic world. A particularly illustrative example of this perceived partiality is Herodotus' account of the Battle of Thermopylae, in which the Thebans are depicted as reluctant participants, allegedly held under duress by the Spartans. Yet it is important to recognize that Plutarch's critique, while influential, was not universally accepted in antiquity. Other notable intellectuals of the time, such as Theopompus, Aristarchus, Dionysius of Halicarnassus, and Lucian, expressed admiration for Herodotus' prose, narrative skill, and ethnographic scope. And with this, we conclude today's analysis. I hope that you enjoyed this deep dive into how the Greek people became one. Thank you very much for watching, and remember, the Metatron has spread his wings. Goodbye.